Slater.
The great Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Senator, how do you do, sir?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back on with you.
Well, it's wonderful to talk to you. You've been very busy. Thanks for taking time. One of the hearings we have not covered yet is energy. Chris Wright. So tell us what happened yesterday in the hearing with the Department of Energy Secretary.
I thought Chris Wright handled himself very well and professionally. I look forward to voting for him to be our next Secretary of Energy. The Democrats obviously obsessed about climate change. Unfortunately for them, Chris Wright knows more about supposed climate change and its supposed impacts than they have forgotten. And he understands that the best way to both have a clean, healthy environment and prosperous economy is to have the kind of fossil fuel technology that we have perfected in recent years to provide reliable, affordable baseload energy. Just look at the boom in natural gas over the last 25 years in American energy production. It burns much more cleanly than coal did in yesteryear, and it provides the kind of electricity that we need not just today, but for the future. As you have more and more demands for things like AI data centers or more devices or electric vehicles or what have you. But we also got into some of the other, critical missions that the Department of Energy performs, often escape notice in the public eye.
Yes.
Almost half of the Department of Energy's budget is helping our nuclear enterprise produce uranium and plutonium pits for nuclear energy and our nuclear weapons. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration before them, have let those functions woefully atrophy. The Department of Energy also runs our national labs, places like Los Alamos and Sandia and Lawrence Livermore, where we do cutting-edge research into nuclear energy or quantum computing and artificial intelligence.
Wow.
Your listeners will probably be shocked to hear that last year there were more than 8,000 Chinese and Russian scientists walking around those labs. This is long stuck in my craw because, as you can imagine, American scientists don't get invited to Chinese and Russian equivalent labs. So Chris Wright, I think, is the right man for the job,
Wow.
not only on what most Americans think about of traditional energy production, but also on things like making sure that we have the nuclear fuel that our country needs and we're not letting China and Russia steal all of our most sensitive scientific secrets.
Wow, that's amazing. We can talk about the CIA director in a moment, too. Similarly, do you believe there should be / will be a revolution of nuclear energy with a Chris Wright and Donald Trump? And I speak that having spent time in California, they used to have a bunch of nuclear power plants, and they're shutting them down. They're just, for no reason, they're just closing them down. Are we going to see the opposite in this country?
Well, there certainly should be, as you say, because nuclear technology is greatly advanced. It's incredibly safe now. It's much more efficient. It can be built on smaller sites with smaller reactors. It's probably essential, again, for the boom in electricity demand that we're seeing in America. Will it be? We're going to have to overcome a lot of bureaucratic and liberal resistance.
Yes.
And it won't just be Chris Wright at the Department of Energy, but leaders at places like the EPA with Lee Zeldin or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But I do believe that President Trump, like me and most Republicans in Congress, is committed to harnessing the full potential of nuclear power. I mean, just look at what's happened in Germany over the last 15 years when Angela Merkel declared that they would shut down a lot of their baseload power production plants and how badly it's harmed their economy. You just can't, again, you can't have a modern, prosperous society without widespread, affordable, and reliable power. Nothing against, say, solar power and wind power, but it only works when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. Nuclear power, gas power, all the rest always work.
Yes. You also spoke of the fact that Arkansas, your state, has 19 million tons of lithium reserves. So it just seems like we have an administration now that wants to get all this stuff out of the ground. And if I may, ask you about Arkansas, but if I may also pivot that to Greenland. The more I'm hearing about Greenland, the more obvious this is. I'm likening it to when Trump ran for president in 2015 and people laughed. And then he laughed right all the way into the White House. It's the same thing now. It's like, oh, Greenland, ha, ha, ha. And then you're like, oh, wait. Oh, no, we definitely need Greenland. And among other reasons, one of them is the rare earth metals too, right?
Sure. President Trump and I talked about this in private some in his first term, and then it got out that he was considering this. He was talking about it within his administration with senators, and he was mocked and laughed at the way he was in 2015, as you point out. And he encouraged me to write a defense of it. And of all places that wanted to publish that defense, it was in the New York Times. So
Wow.
your listeners can go back to the New York Times op-ed page in the summer of 2019 and see my op-ed that lays out the very detailed case for why America should obviously buy Greenland. And again, this is a case of all of the president's critics calling him crazy when he's really crazy like a fox.
Yeah.
He's not the first American president to realize this. Harry Truman tried to buy Greenland. And for the same reasons, we're so grateful now that Abraham Lincoln and William Seward acquired Alaska from Russia, which at the time was called Seward's Folly. And no one thinks it's folly anymore when you consider all of the oil and gas up there, the critical strategic terrain it provides for early warning systems for Russian or Chinese missiles, just like Greenland would do. The fact that if Russia had a foothold in North America, it would expose us to much graver dangers, just like China is trying to obtain a foothold in Greenland. For all these reasons, it is clearly in America's interest that we obtain sovereignty over Greenland. I know the left gets the vapors over such things, thinks it's a relic of the colonial era. I would point out that the patron saint of modern progressivism, Woodrow Wilson, also bought territory from Denmark. We now call it the Virgin Islands.
Yep.
So there's a long precedent for that. And for that matter, it would be better for the people of Greenland. There's about 50,000 Greenlanders. It is a major strain on the budget and resources of a relatively small country like Denmark to support them, which is why they don't have the services that they otherwise would, why they don't have the services that Alaskans do. It would be better for them to have the United States and our resources and our $28 trillion economy to back them up.
Yes.
A win all around.
Yeah, and we bought the Virgin Islands because of its strategic location next to our Panama Canal. So it's something else we need to take back as well. The delta between how much this Greenland idea is laughed at versus how obvious it is that we need to do it is greater than anything I've seen before. It's like it's the most obvious thing. Russia planted a Russian flag on the seabed of the North Pole with their submarines. Like they want it. China wants it. And we're sitting back like, ha, ha, ha. And we're just going to let them have it. It's insane. All right. Enough of that. We're all about it, Senator. Like we're talking about it nonstop ad nauseum here. So we're in your corner. You also talked with the CIA appointee. What is the CIA's actual mission that we need to get back to?
Well, the Central Intelligence Agency is supposed to collect intelligence. Seems pretty obvious. And unfortunately, they've drifted away from that mission because of failed leadership, especially under Barack Obama and Joe Biden. President Trump made some gains. Unfortunately, they backslid again. Just think about where we've stood in recent days. I mean, I'm now the chair of the Intelligence Committee. I went into the Thanksgiving holiday without any idea that jihadi rebels were about to rampage across Syria and topple the Assad regime. We were totally in the dark about Hamas's attack against Israel on October 7th, 2023. And this is because intelligence collection has atrophied at the CIA as they've had misplaced priorities. I cannot tell you how many reports I see about climate change or whether some sub-Saharan African country is going to adopt gay rights legislation. These may be appropriate topics for someone in the government, but not for our CIA, especially when our intelligence community is failing to provide the critical and timely information that the president and the Congress needs to make vital national security decisions. So there's a lot to be done there. I know that John Ratcliffe will do it in terms of prioritizing recruiting and retention of the case officers who do the core work, the meat eaters, not the leaf eaters, making sure that the people who are at the headquarters, the analysts who are using and harnessing that intelligence are focused on the priorities, that we're not putting bodies against problems like climate change or internal domestic political questions for other countries, but say China's military buildup or Iran's nuclear program or ISIS terrorist plotting. the men and women of the CIA are dedicated to that mission. I mean, it's a fairly self-selecting group. These people did not join a college choir. They didn't join, the Department of Labor. They chose to go work at the CIA, and they want leaders. It's just like in the military. The morale is always highest in the military when you're closest to the front lines in the fighting. I saw that myself. I mean, Marines in Fallujah, despite all the hardships they faced, were a much hardier and happier band of warriors than the kind of surly 19-year-old airmen whose job it was to sit in Kuwait and tell you what time the next C-130 took off. People who join the CIA do it because they're mission-driven and they love our country and they want to contribute to our country's safety.
Really good
not
point.
Focus on climate change.
Really good. I'm so glad you said that, because I was going to ask a follow-up of, like, can you institutionally change something like that so quickly? But I think you can, based on what you just said. Two more questions, if I can, real quick, Senator. I want to ask you what. So you're the guy I go to find out what's next. You're always ahead of it. You're the first person I ever heard of COVID from. That would have been like back in like January, probably like January 2020. You're the first person I ever heard that word. And then here you are writing editorials about Greenland in 2019. What's the next thing? What things should we be keeping an eye on? What are you most excited about that you don't hear people talking about?
Well, what worries me most, of course, as Senator Rubio said yesterday at his hearing, as John Ratcliffe said at his hearing, is the threat that China poses to us. Because it's not currently a hot war, as you see in Ukraine, where Russia invaded, or in the Middle East, where Hamas viciously attacked Israel. But Israel has done an excellent job over the last 15 months of beating back its enemies on all fronts, to include in Iran. China is still, no question, our greatest threat, and it's a threat on all fronts. In fact, I have a book coming out about it next month that explains that China remains an evil empire, just like Ronald Reagan said about Soviet Russia. It's waging economic world war against us. It's planning for an actual war. It's infiltrated our society and government from the highest reaches of Washington to your local city councils and chamber of commerce. And if we don't realize that, and if we don't fight back, if we don't prepare to deter China in this economic conflict and a potential military conflict, then we will lose to China in the race for global supremacy.
Yep, and they'll take Greenland and Panama and all the rest. Last question for you, Senator. We spent a lot of time today talking about the warrior ethos in light of Hegseth talking about wanting to restore that and what that means. It sounds good, but like, what is the warrior ethos? And we talked about that for a while, and then we got into this conversation about a gentleman called in whose dad fought at Krinkelt, and he went over there with his son, who's also in this military, to go see where his dad served. And then it reminded me that the other day, Vance went to the gravesite of where 5 generations of Vances are buried in eastern Kentucky. And I think that's like one of the most beautiful things ever, to take a time out before he becomes vice president to become grounded in the land that his family has lived on and served for so long. Does that speak to you as well? Like Vance going back to that gravesite?
Oh, sure. In the same way that, I now appreciate the fact that I was able to, work the land in Arkansas with my father, that he worked with his father, and his father had worked with his father going back more than a century. Now, I can't say I always appreciated it as a young kid. Yeah. when my friends were off playing basketball. But a kind of connection to our roots is something that we often lose in modern society. And, JD's trip did not get much attention from the media, I think in part because especially in big cities, on the coastal areas, you just don't have that at all. But in places like Arkansas and like Kentucky, it still matters a lot. And we should always remember, even if we don't always remember their names going back 4 and 5 generations, how much our ancestors sacrificed so we could live the kind of life we have today.
Yeah, it's time we get back to it. Senator Tom Cotton, send Tom Cotton on the Twitter. Please follow, of course, Senator from Arkansas. Sir, very grateful. Keep up the wonderful work.
Thank you. Good to be on with you.
Appreciate you. Coming up next, we'll talk to the congressman who wrote the Lake and Riley Act. Next, Mike Slater, Breitbart News Daily. Spread the bill.